Hello kiddos, welcome back, and today's video lecture is going to go over our very first macromolecule. So let's jump right into it, shall we? Time for a guessing game. There's 4 macromolecules that we've been talking about: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Which one do you think we'll talk about today? I'll give you one hint. And I may or may not have eaten all of these by myself in 2 days. Not saying it's a good choice, it's just one that I may or may not have made. So, if you guessed carbohydrates, you are correct. We're about to delve into the carb territory, and that is a territory I very much enjoy. Carbohydrates are huge molecules, they're macromolecules. They are also known as sugars. Now, some carbs you may not identify as sugars right away. For example, bread. You wouldn't think of bread as sugar unless you're thinking of sweet bread, and I always do. But bread is a carb, it's sugar. Now, it doesn't taste sweet because it's a specific type of sugar, but some you add extra sugar to, so they do taste sweet. The monomer, so the building block to make a carbohydrate, is called a monosaccharide. Mono, one, saccharide means sugar. So monosaccharides are those building blocks, those tiny Lego pieces that we talked about in the last class. And so there's different kinds of carbohydrates. The simplest of the carbohydrates, so the less complicated Lego structures, those are our simple sugars. Those are easier to digest and break down, and those you can think of things like fruit, like this banana. It's not a real banana, it's a panda banana, but for example, fruits have a lot of simple sugars, and so if you consume a lot of fruit, you have a lot of energy right to burn. However, Oreos are also technically a lot of sugars, but they're not simple sugars. These are complex and bad sugars that I should not be eating, but quarantine. So simple sugars are easier to digest and break down. Therefore, your body uses them up quickly, and they are the ones that you should be consuming. Monosaccharides are the words that I need you to remember. One, sugar. That's the building block, your monomer. Okay? There's a few different kinds of monosaccharides. These are 3 main ones. Glucose, one that you can think of as, yeah, there is glucose by itself, like you can buy glucose, but it is the most common known monosaccharide. Its structure, it's C6H12O6, and we may have used this in chemistry to talk about like the molecules and count the atoms. So if you remember that, that's a hint to what we've done in the past. Glucose is also the sugar that plants make, and remember, you know, plants make their own food. So what they're making when they make their own food through photosynthesis is glucose. They're making the sugar. And we also have things like fructose and galactose. Fructose you probably have heard of before. It's in a lot of sweet things that you consume on a daily basis. And you'll notice all 3 words have a common pattern. First off, they have the same chemical formula. I know that's probably not what you were able to tell, and we'll talk about what you were able to tell in just a second. All of them have that formula, C6H12O6. That is how sugars are formed. Those are your configurations for monosaccharides. However, they have a different structure. So the way that the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens are connected together is different, and that's what makes them different from each other. So for example, here we have the glucose is connected to the H on top and to the OH on the bottom, the hydroxide. On the galactose, it's inverted. So the hydroxide's on the top and the hydrogen's on the bottom. And that is the only difference. They have the same amount of carbons, same amount of hydrogens, same amount of oxygens, but they behave differently when you consume them. So the structure of a macromolecule is very important, because then that's how your body will be able to process it. How easy it will be to break this molecule apart in order to utilize the energy. Carbohydrates are normally in what we call a ring structure, so they're connected one to the other in a ring-like format. So if each of these hexagons you can identify as a monosaccharide, as a sugar, then when you see a ring or chain of a bunch of these together, you are able to tell that's a carbohydrate. You will always see them in that hexagonal shape. That's the structure of a carbohydrate. Now, what if you have two of them together? What if you have two monomers, two monosaccharides together? Well, that's what we call a disaccharide. Di meaning two sugars in that molecule, right? So some common disaccharides are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So some of those you may be familiar with, some of them you may not, but they're all still sugars. They're just more complicated sugars. And if you have more than two together, you have a polysaccharide. So this is the polymer of your carbohydrates. Many sugars, many saccharides, right? So you have your rings of more than two. Two are still the disaccharide. Disaccharide is still technically a polymer because there's more than one monosaccharide. But when there's more than two, we refer to them as polysaccharides. The most common of these are starch. Sorry, it says disaccharides there. That should say polysaccharides. Starch, glycogen, and cellulose. And for example, glycogen is what we and many other animals use to store energy. So these glycogen molecules are then used up later on, right? So at the meantime, they store that energy, and then we are able to utilize it. Cellulose is what is found in the cell wall of plants. It's something that we ourselves cannot digest, and so that's when you have, plants that don't really break down in your stomach, and you might be able to see them after they're exited from your body or from any animal's body. Then we have this notion that these are much more complex sugars. So the cell wall of plants is what gives it its structure. It should be pretty solid, pretty impenetrable. So it's going to be a very complicated sugar. It's going to be much harder to break through. That means it's also going to be harder for stomach acid to break it through, right? So think of polymers in carbohydrates as extremely hard to digest molecules. Some examples of these include pasta, bread, like I mentioned before, donuts, rice. These are all carbohydrates. The pasta, for example, is a much more complex sugar, whereas things like fruits are much simpler sugars. So everything with moderation. Just remember that, yes, fruits are good for you, but if you only eat fruits, then that's also not good. You are still consuming a very large amount of sugar in comparison to all the other biomolecules your body needs. So you have to be careful that everything is with moderation. That's why people go into studying nutrition now, so we know how much we should be eating of different types of foods and that we should have a balanced diet, right? What is the function of these carbohydrates? So now I've told you all this information about how they are made structurally, what they look like in everyday life, right? What the monomer and the polymer is. Why do we actually need these carbohydrates? Well, it's our main source of energy. You may have heard me mention the word energy throughout this presentation. Remember, we need energy to be able to do things. Anything as simple as raise your hand or walk, or something as complicated as running a marathon. You need energy in your body to be able to process and do all these tasks. And not only motion, but processes in your body when you're asleep, when you're just sitting down. There's certain processes that your body is still doing, and you need energy for your cells to be able to work. Now, it also has a little bit of short-term energy storage. So if you can think of like marathon runners, like I mentioned earlier, they eat a lot before the race, but they only eat certain things, right? Like they'll have like their fruit smoothie or something to be able to be on it, right? It's a simple sugar that they're able to utilize as energy as soon as they need it. The cell walls of plants are also made up of carbohydrates, cellulose specifically, and it does provide some structure to us, right? So the overview: monomers are the monosaccharides, the polymers are the polysaccharides. Mono means one, di means two, poly means many. Remember those prefixes and suffixes I need you to know off the top of your head. And saccharide means sugar. The most common monosaccharide is glucose. Please remember glucose, C6H12O6. You don't have to remember the formula yet, but I'd start working on it if I were you. The function is for short-term energy storage and cell walls in plants. Those are the two main uses. All carbohydrates have the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If you think back to the pictures I showed you earlier with the hexagons, there was a lot of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And there's actually a specific ratio of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There are 2 times the number of hydrogens than there are oxygens and carbons. There's a 1-to-1 ratio. So 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 2 is 12. Hydrogen has 12, each of the other 2 have 6. Now, another thing you may have noticed earlier that I did not bring up is the fact that they end up in the letters OSE. Most carbohydrates do end up with the "ose" suffix, and that's how you can tell they're a carbohydrate. Glucose, sucrose, maltose, galactose, fructose, all the O's will let you know that is usually a carbohydrate. That is it. So let me know if you have any questions tomorrow during class and answer the 2 questions down below. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.